121 going out to you on the New Year's Day 2022. Andrew's with me to bring us the latest in the ongoing saga of Omicron, COVID-19, whatever having yourself, new COVID varieties, whatever. It's like Heinz. How many varieties? More than 57. Yeah. And things were, last week's show, or the last show we did sometime just before, I think it was just before Christmas, had to be one of the most sobering shows. And I'm usually sober anyway. But it wasn't going in the right direction, and it probably hasn't changed much since, has it? The direction is still
whoop.
Yeah.
Basically. We had in the south, we had 106,500 cases in the last 7 days. So over 100,000 in 7 days. And for comparison, the first wave had 25,000 cases detected. Now, there was probably more like 75,000 in reality. But we've still, in that week, then we've had more cases than we did in the first wave. So there's a good one to start off with.
Okay, can we reliably say that the 106,500 cases, like, surely there's probably more to be detected than that as well, because we've heard stories about people not getting PCR.
Yeah, it's very hard to get a PCR test at the moment. And indeed, they've now tried to deal with that by saying if you're under 40, that they won't PCR test you unless you've got a positive antigen test, essentially.
Right.
Which is obviously to try and protect capacity towards the older, more vulnerable ages of 40-year-olds and over. So there you go. If you're over 40, you're now in that vulnerable age group. Nolan tweeted out a couple of days ago that they reckoned there was probably about 40% more cases than they were detecting, and that then there would probably be twice that number of infections. So in other words, that 100,000 is probably pushing for maybe as high as 300,000 infections, probably 150,000 what would have been cases before Christmas, something in that sort of ballpark. All kind of loose. They're loose numbers, but so huge it doesn't really matter if I'm out 10% one way or the other.
No, because I noticed in the Guardian they were saying, National Statistics Agency was saying 1 in 25 people were infected.
Oh, I said that.
They do this random swabs of families, and they said in London it was 1 in 15 people were actually infected last week.
Yeah, so we're probably roughly similar then if we had a similar program here, because if you assume similar testing. That's probably reasonable enough. And anecdotally that feels right, because it feels like everybody I know has a case somewhere in their family.
Yeah.
Like our extended family or whatever, or friends or, whatever else. And most of those people are having problems getting PCR confirmation testing.
Totally, yeah.
At this point in time. So that's where we are. Now, in the last week, we have had 740 people, new hospital cases. So that's people going to hospital and either being positive before or after they're admitted to hospital. And that's 178% of the previous week. So in other words, that new hospital case figures in the week is going up almost as fast as the cases are going up.
So that was 100 and what?
178% of the previous week. Whereas the week of cases is 225% of the previous week. So we're seeing similar levels of increase. Now, I think this is what's interesting, because so there's a problem, the usual problem with lag, right? In that cases ending up in hospital are generally tested positive on average of 6 days earlier. Not always, but that's a kind of working ratio that kind of works. And we're still running at by that measure at about 1.25% of cases being hospitalised. Kind of complicated in lots of different ways now at the moment. So what that would suggest is that the 100,000 cases this week, by next week we'll see about 1,250 people in hospital, give or take a bit, right? Somewhere in that sort of region.
Right.
Now that's so that's both a dreadfully large number.
It is.
But actually, it also gives you an idea of just how effective the vaccination campaign has been, because in the Delta surge Alpha. Well, it was a mixture. In this time last year in January, we had, I think, 125,000 cases in January, and we peaked at 2,200 in hospital, right? So from a similar number, you're talking about a much smaller hospital peak. So yeah, there's kind of like there's good news and bad news, and the good news is that the protection, it holds up, but the problem that we were flagging, which is if lots of people get infected, then that becomes a problem. But it does.
That they were stating in South Africa that not as many people, it seemed to be less dangerous in terms of like some of the initial data. They're very prone to, they're not likely to say that this comes with a lot of warnings and caveats. So that's one part of it. But then the other thing was that there was less likelihood in terms of leading to hospitalisation. And then there was figures I read about in terms of having the booster. The vaccination really provides added protection about being hospitalised, up to 80%, they say. Up to 80% preventing hospitalisation. But the whole key point here is that 1,000, like, the figures that you were talking about last week was 106,000. So we can safely assume that that's probably more likely a realistic figure of 150,000. And then if you take the 1.25%, because even my maths can hold up to that, it means over 1,000, over 1,200 people, or over 1,500 people needing hospitalisation, and we don't have those beds, do we?
Well, we've the peak of the January wave, I think it was 2,200. Might have been 2020. It's somewhere in that region. So, I mean, that has been fitted in before. It obviously means you're shutting down just about everything else. But a couple of points on that, because so that's if that 1.25% relationship holds.
Yeah.
However, because Omicron appears to have some intrinsic reduced severity, then that may not hold. So it may be fewer people need hospital treatment. Probably not massively fewer, but it might be, say, 20% fewer, which takes a chunk out of it. But the other thing that also appears to be happening is that of the people who need hospital treatment, quite a lot of them don't need as much, so they're in and out quicker, in other words.
Okay.
This is what's been said in other countries. So that actually has a bigger impact, because the number in hospital it's a flow. It's people going in and people coming out. So if people come out faster, so for instance, if you were on average only getting hospitalised for 5 days instead of 7, then instead of ending up with a peak around 12, well, not a peak, but say instead of having 1,200 in hospital this day next week, you might have 900. Because some of the people would have come out again.
Okay.
So I think those two are going to be pretty important in terms of what happens, because otherwise, once we hit 200,000 cases in a week, we kind of exhaust hospital capacity, right? Of course, we probably couldn't measure 200,000 cases in a week.
Yeah.
But if there's reduced,
we're heading there.
If Omicron is less severe, and I'm using less severe rather than mild, because I think mild is ridiculous to call something that's hospitalising 1 in 100 or more.
Yeah.
But if it is less severe, and if that means slightly fewer people, a slightly smaller proportion need to go into hospital, and of those that need to go in, some of them come out a couple of days earlier than they would previously, then maybe you're talking about having 300,000 cases in a week, as impossible as that seems, actually being something that the health system can cope with. Now, it seems that's what's been bet on at the moment, right? That seems to be the expectation. And
so I counted 2 ifs and 1 maybe.
Well, there's no certainty on that. That's the thing. Like, there's no way of knowing until it's happened. The only kind of data we have, I think South African conditions are so different that I wouldn't pull too heavily on presuming we're going to have the same experience that they had. Probably Denmark and the UK figures are better, but they're really only a couple of days ahead of us, So they're both seeing considerably increased hospital admissions, and both certainly UK is expecting a serious
spike.
Well, it's a serious crisis in the health service, so they're talking about opening up Nightingale wards and all this bullshit again. I mean, I say bullshit because the problem isn't beds, the problem is staff. That there's not enough medical workers to actually cover these things. So unless you're just going to warehouse people and feed them or something, which is then, and they're kind of talking about that because what they're talking about is that if you're in hospital for 5 or 6 days, the last couple of days maybe you don't need that much actual treatment. You're just it's recovery and observation. So what they're talking about is they might move those people into these Nightingale facilities
Into
or
a
whatever.
warehouse.
Into a warehouse, yeah. So you get fed for a couple of days. So I mean, like that's one way of coping with it. I mean, I don't know. The HSE hasn't really talked about similar plans here, but that may be where we end up in a couple of weeks if it keeps going up at the rate it is. But we'll see.
Okay, so is there anything that would lead us to believe that it's not going to continue going at the rate
Not
that
really,
it is?
No, there's
okay.
not.
And
I mean,
was
change behaviours. I mean, essentially that might do it, but that's not going to kick in for another 10 days.
I saw that somebody else again in The Guardian was saying that the UK needed to do something, but they needed to do something on Christmas Eve, Boxing Day, or whatever else, because the time lag is now. So they're kind of holding up their hands and just expecting the wave now, because there's nothing, because everything should have happened 10 days ago.
Well, that's the other factor with that, trying to work out how many people will be in hospital next week.
Yeah.
Is that we don't know the age profile of the cases we're talking about, right? And certainly the big concern would be that the older, that the cases in the build up to Christmas were mostly among young people, right? And increasingly that was the case as more and more people got boosted, and particularly that kind of 19 to 34 age group.
Yeah.
But of course, what we do know is that at Christmas, lots of those people mixed with lots of older people, like parents and grandparents. And what we don't yet have an idea is how many infections that resulted in terms of those parents and grandparents becoming infected. And in turn, because people of that age tend to socialise with other people of that age, is that meaning that there's now lots of transmission chains running through the 50s, 60s, and 70-year-olds?
Yeah.
So that obviously could radically make that hospital ratio worse if that has happened. If it's the case that because most people in that age group were boosted within the last 2 months, and maybe that will mean infections will be much less common than they would have been otherwise, and might be some added impact in terms of them being less severe, well then maybe that won't be such a problem. But it's that's the whole problem. Like the trying to accurately say how quickly the hospital crisis will become unsustainable is very hard because of all those different variables.
Okay. Then has there been any changes in terms of like from a policy initiative? We heard that Tony was talking about families shouldn't mix at all. So
he said that on Stevenson's Day, I think.
Day, right.
Which was obviously trying to dissuade people from doing stuff for New Year's Eve.
Yeah.
And the government came out with nothing. I mean, and I think there's a thing that annoys me there, which is like, what was it, 3 weeks ago? They had the whole kind of effectively gagging NEFIT members and not allowing them to go on media without prior approval, and this was so that the messaging would be united, and the politicians would they'd format stuff and put it out, but they've been completely silent over this whole period as this crisis has rolled out. And obviously
they've just gone totally missing.
There should have been a recommendation that people not have more than, not have 4 households for New Year's Eve.
They should have went back against the guidelines they'd already issued because of the worsening situation. People would either pay attention to that or not, and probably quite a lot of people wouldn't. But the thing is, because they didn't do it, there are other people who would have gone, oh well, if that's what we're meant to do now, then that's what we should actually do. And it could have reduced the impact of what may or may not have happened last night. We'll see as we go forward for that. So that's the problem, that there's a whole load of infections that will have happened from Christmas Day to New Year's Eve, which as yet we're not seeing,
probably some of those people are now get testing positive on antigen tests or feeling ill or whatever, and they'll be getting tested, starting yesterday, today, tomorrow, sort of in those next few days. But that could be a very different population in terms of age structures and also risk factors than was the case for the earlier period that we're pulling that 1.25% from. So that's one of my concerns there is what exactly is going to happen with that.
Okay, and just in terms of guidance in this whole area, right, has it effectively been, there's been nothing heard from the government since, was it before Christmas? What was the last time that...
Yeah, I mean, like, Micheál Martin tweeted something about it being a serious situation.
Right, that's great. Thanks, Micheál.
Yeah, nothing useful. The only thing they've said is about shortening the quarantine.
That's the only thing.
That's
right?
about the only.
And is that only if that's on the
test.
basis of getting workers back into work?
Yeah. It's like I was talking to a friend from Greystones earlier, and she was saying that a couple of days ago, 2 of the 3 pubs were closed. And two restaurants were closed.
Right.
And presumably I think one of the restaurants had said it was COVID, but presumably in all those cases, that's staff members who are either infected or close contacts, and enough of them that they can't run. And that's going to be happening. I mean, January's going to be weird because that's going to be happening to school teachers, it's going to be happening to bus drivers, to train drivers, it's going to be happening to retail workers. So I think there's going to be an awful lot.
There won't be an actual lockdown. There will be a lot of places that won't be able to open.
There'll be a lot of places that won't be able to open.
Yeah,
and also, I mean, like, in terms of hospitality, there'll be an awful lot of people who won't want to go out. Although I guess there are a couple of 100,000 people who've just recovered from infection and probably feel slightly bulletproof in the short term. So there'll be that business. But that's where we are. So yeah, it's like, I mean, I think the other way of thinking about all this is that a couple of months back, we were talking about what the future cost would be of the virus over the next year, in terms of its impact. As it slowly infected everybody, because that existing with COVID, that is what the end result of that is, and how that could be quite significant, and you could be looking at 3,000 deaths maybe over the year or whatever else. And lots of hospitalizations. And I think with Omicron, what we're actually seeing is all that packed into what will be a month and a half, maybe, or a month at the rate cases are going. With something that hopefully, if it is intrinsically milder, at least will reduce those numbers somewhat, which is not insignificant. But it will create a much worse crisis for the health service because of it all happening over, a year. It will all happen over 2 months, basically.
Okay, so it's all getting concertinaed into this next period, which is what, the next 3 weeks, the next 4 weeks?
I think it'll be fairly short, because if you think about the rate of let's take that figure of 106,000 known infections last week, right? Yeah. And let's say, well, that's probably really 250,000, right? In terms of that, the 250,000 is probably a conservative estimate. It could be 300,000, right? And the rate... Really?
It's more than... I thought it was going to be like maybe 40% more or 50% more. You think it's like...
That's the undercount for cases, right?
Yeah.
But cases have always been an undercount of actual infections. Okay. So probably, in the first wave, we probably only caught 1 infection in 3 as a case, right? That's generally accepted. And then in the run-up to Christmas, with those NEFIT models of where the peak would be, that peak was based on the assumption that either 40% of infections were reported as cases, or 60% were, right? That was the difference between the optimistic and pessimistic.
Right.
So let's split the difference and say half.
50%. Okay, yeah. So that means then theoretically... Well, that's not 106, so that's what, 220,000?
Well, if you take, so to do that maths again, so if the 106,000 has a significant undercount of what would previously have been recorded as cases, maybe that's really 150,000, right?
Right.
And if it's an undercount, and if cases are an undercount of half in relation to infections, then that's really 300,000.
Okay,
right?
So that's...
And what we know is that cases doubled, more than doubled in the last week, right? So in other words, the infections, even leaving aside Christmas and New Year, almost certainly increasing that again. I mean, if you think about it, it's entirely possible that if we went into that period with 300,000 people infected, and there's much more social mixing,
Yeah.
It's not impossible that means there's 900,000 people now brewing up the virus. Basically, that will, and about 300,000 then will get counted as cases. Well, they won't, because we can't test that much over the next week. And then, if that doubles again, that's 1.8 million. So you can sort of see why I'm saying at current rates, this ends quite quickly, because the virus runs out of people to infect.
Yeah.
And there's obviously a population, particularly older people, that will be now not going out at all. So maybe they'll escape that, which will be good. But yeah, it's like it basically anybody who's continuing to socialise will probably get infected quite briefly. I mean, yeah, somebody else was telling me that they were going to a wedding, and that the assumption was just that they were going to get infected. So the planning was just, okay, we'll just isolate for 10 days or 14 days afterwards.
It's inevitable.
Because it was inevitable, So obviously, and I think a lot of people are probably making that sort of calculation as well.
I don't understand, though, in terms of like everybody getting infected, where does vaccination come in then? I mean, the vaccination...
So this is the thing about...
If everyone's getting infected, then vaccination's not working.
Yeah, so let's dial it back a little bit, right? Because so the uncertainty is... So what we do know is that what makes Omicron more effective than previous variants is it can evade immunity, right?
Yeah.
So previously, if you'd been infected already recently, or if you'd been double vaccinated and we were looking at Delta, well then mostly you were not going to get infected again by Delta in this time period, right? But with Omicron, you will be if you're exposed to it. That's what the difference is, right? The vaccinations, that double dose one, still holds up pretty well against you being hospitalised. So you get infected, but your chances of then going to hospital are still reduced to maybe 10 or 20% of what it would have been previous. So that's where it holds up, and that's what we're seeing in the hospital figures. That's why we don't have 2,000 or 2,500 in hospital today, because that is working. So one of the unknowns is, okay, so we've just boosted half the adult population, and that's the most vulnerable half of the adult population, right? And there's a reasonable expectation and some evidence that if you've been recently boosted, then Omicron is less likely to be able to infect you, because basically your body is now pumping out antibodies. And although Omicron has kind of arrived with a comedy hat and a false moustache, so it won't be recognised, if your body is full of antibodies looking for COVID, then it'll recognise it enough that maybe you won't get infected, or if you do, it will clear pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I mean, I've also heard so many anecdotal stories of people being infected after being boosted, including 14 days after. Yeah. So
those figures are coming from the UK as well.
Like it's definitely happening at quite a rate. So that's the other complicating thing when we're talking about this. Are we talking about the entire population being infected, apart from the people isolating? Or are we talking about the unvaccinated half being infected, and then maybe some of the vaccinated half, but maybe it's quite a low rate? So, like maybe these anecdotal stories we're hearing are either people where, there's an exceptional reason, or maybe they went to a party where there were 10 other people in the room infected, and it was just so much virus that it overcame that, or what. We don't really know in those things. But, I mean, either way, the point I'm driving at is that the current rate of doubling, when we have such an astoundingly high number of cases, and that's going to double or more every week, means you run out of people, you run out of people in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, you're just going to run out of them. That's the way it's going to work.
Okay, so that's kind of the background. Like, all this is known as well in terms of NEFID, I presume, and everybody else. And the only thing that we've changed in terms of policy, with 106 known cases, is we've changed the days down from 7 to, or is it from 10 to 7?
It's so complicated. I'd say go and look it up.
Right. Okay.
Because it also depends on whether or not you've been boosted.
All right, so there's multiple things.
Boosted.
But that's the only
and I think
thing
you need to be 2 days after symptoms as well, and there's a whole lot going on with that. So I'm not going to
fair enough
wrongly summarise it because it's too complicated.
That's grand, but you'll get it probably on one of the websites anyway. And there's no meeting, but there doesn't seem to be any kind of other alternative. It's just, let's just ride this thing through.
So I think that my reading
is there any plan What is the plan?
My reading of it is that Omicron is quite hard to stop. It's because of its ability to overcome immunity. If we go into a full lockdown would work just as well as it has on any previous occasion, right? But you would have the difficulty then is that when you come out of it, then it just starts spreading again, right? And also the other difficulty you have is, okay, well, what's the purpose of the lockdown? What are you trying to get to? Now, the only thing, there's two things, I think, in which you could make an argument. One is to allow as many kids as possible to get vaccinated, because that's only just become possible. So there's, a large unvaccinated population. Individual kid is at low risk, but it's not zero. And there's enough rare severe consequences that it is a bit of a big deal. Because normally kids don't get very sick. So even if it's a small number getting very sick, that's kind of unusual, So that's one thing. And then the other thing is there are some quite powerful antiviral drugs coming online at the moment, but they're in quite small quantities now. So you could say, well, if we could delay this 3 months, then in 3 months' time we'll have more. But leaving those two aside, it is kind of the case. Okay, well, what would the purpose be, and what's the cost? And obviously, the cost would be huge. And if all you're doing is delaying something for 3 months, and then you're looking at exactly the same thing again, then maybe there's not a purpose to it. There isn't. I don't think there's going to be an attempt to eliminate at this stage on in terms of the European Union. And
isn't this this is where we got, because we've allowed it to become endemic, so now we're just going to have to deal with every single variety that comes along.
Variant that is what existing with COVID is.
So it's going to be dealing with this, and so we may not. So is there a likelihood then that we're going to go through this peak really quickly within the next month, come out the other side of it? Are we then going to be dealing with another variety or variant or whatever?
We don't know.
Like?
I mean, clearly that is possible. Clearly it's possible. I mean, the one thing you can say is that with repeated challenges, whether that's via vaccination or infection, the expectation would be that the immune system, certainly of anybody under the age of, say, 60, gets better at fighting it off each time. So that over time, hospitalizations under that age group should become much rarer. Say 60 to 75, it's more complicated because your immune system is starting to wane. It's not as strong. That will be some people at the younger end of that spectrum will be affected badly, and most people at the older end will be. But that'll be quite mixed in between. And then 75 plus, you're kind of in trouble. Just because your ability of the immune system for long-term learning is quite limited at that age. And that's why, older people are vulnerable to flus and, all sorts of other things like that. That's part of the story there. So,
this is our maker.
But
we're all going to meet our maker at one stage or another.
So, but it changes the... It basically means that, yes, even if we see repeated variants, you would expect the impact hospitalisation-wise to be reduced because at least that younger end of the population is taken out of the equation. Right. But I think even making that level of prediction is risky, given the way that it's kept. As we've had new variants coming, it's just kept doing things that weren't really expected of it. It's outwitted us, I think, repeatedly at this stage. So, being anyway certain about how that's going to look, I think we can only do in retrospect. I think we can definitely say this probably won't be the last one. But it might be that there won't be a significant issue until, say, next winter. If that might be the case. Or not. That's something we don't know.
But we can't really say anything until we get through this one. We haven't even got through this one.
Exactly,
the peak is still to come. So, and when are we expecting the peak? You think within a week?
Well, it depends on those assumptions. I was saying
there's multiple
people who are boosted going to be protected. How many people have just been infected now? Maybe that's a huge number. Could be. So it could be quite soon. We could see a huge number of cases in the next week. Absolutely staggeringly huge. Well, we won't see them. We'll see a very high positivity rate. That's what we'll actually see.
Yeah, because we won't be able to measure them.
Yeah, we won't be able to measure them. But so it could be the actual peak of infections is about to happen.
Yeah.
You know, if the level of mixing was very large over Christmas, because I mean, like if there were 300,000 people infected in that period, that's kind of going to be one in most families. You know, it's that about one person. It's about 1 in 15, is it? Yeah, it's about 1 in 15. So that would definitely have, and because you've
London
both Christmas
figures,
and the New Year,
Yeah.
that would give the potential for every Christmas party or every New Year party, even quite small ones, to have had one infectious person there. And then once that spreads in that way, for the other people in those households to get infected. So you can certainly see how next week could be massive number, or it might be a little bit slower. And
Also, we all go back to work,
though.
Again.
Yeah.
Go back to work.
Yeah, I think, there's a reason why January is normally a big problem anyway, which is just that level of socialisation and patterns of socialisation are such that, you know, any virus, respiratory virus or anything else that can transmit fast will. And that's where we are at the moment, so.
Right, so what do? We just wait and see. And we obviously can't rely on any other, there doesn't appear to be any other plan, so we just...
Yeah, and
just go straight through this. Like, they're not even having meetings. There hasn't been an emergency meeting that we know about.
No, and the problem is, so if you take the scenario where lots of people got infected this week, and we find out about that next week, that could mean we end up with, I don't know, 5,000 people needing to be in hospital at the same time or something. Right. Now that starts to become impossible. I think there's 10 or 11,000 hospital beds in the country, you know, but. You know, so the problem is if what we get is everything squeezed in really tightly at the same time, and there isn't a massive reduction in severity, well, then we could have a real big problem on our hands, which is obviously what they're planning for in terms of the NHS.
Right.
You know, it's something that looks like that. And we won't really know about it till it happens, because it's the problem with the doubling time being as fast as it is at the moment, and also with our case ascertainment being all over the spot. Like that, we're not seeing anything. You know, like for instance, we haven't had a 14-day incidence age-related breakdown since December 22nd, I think, was the last one. Right. You know, and that's just basically because of people not working over Christmas and all that sort of stuff. So it could be that when we get the next one of those, which will probably be the second or the third, we would then see that there's been a huge amount of older people infected, and that will have a very different story than if that hasn't happened. So yeah.
Okay, so all the questions, the ifs and the maybes, are going to get answered in the very short term.
Yeah.
And we just will come back and report on that.
I should give you the 5-day average, because you used to ask for that all the time, and I thought you'd be impressed with it.
Well,
would you like
just
kind of
like, it's almost like, I think it's almost like adopting a government position, which is like, if I don't ask, I won't be shocked. But no, go on, tell me, please.
17,876.
That's 17,000.
876.
Wow. So that's your average.
Yeah, the average number of cases over the last 5 days.
The average is 17,000 a day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, more, call it 18,000. I think you
okay, and anyway, we already know that this is another
low.
count. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that is quite astounding. It's also quite astounding that we can get to that situation and not really have any data, not have any. I mean, I just kind of like, you kind of go like, what, you know, what they seem to be. It seems like the government can just do what they want, or is it like, I mean, what are we all just distracted by social media? Why aren't people, you know? Well, I suppose they just realise that there's nothing they're going to be able to do about it anyway.
Yeah, it's partially that. I mean, part of what worries me is there was an awful lot of commentary in the media running up to Christmas about this being mild, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the reason. There's a lot of people heard that, and so they're not expecting things to get that bad.
I think 106,000 cases probably is a little bit worrying, though, isn't it?
Well, you see, but they've been told they're going to be mild, and you know, and like there's kind of like, I don't think people understood that in order to get into hospital with COVID in the first place, you have to be really bloody sick. You know, like people get sent home just because they're having difficulty breathing, but it's not that serious yet. You know, so I'm a little bit concerned about that sort of like just too many experts and amateurs going on the media airwaves and telling people it was going to be mild, and people maybe not understanding that mild just meant you'd be in hospital for a few days, and mild meant maybe 20% or 30% or 40% less people would end up in ICU, but they'd still go there.
End up in ICU.
May therefore have
still
taken
gonna die.
Yeah, may therefore have taken more risks than they should have.
Right.
But that's we'll see. But I do think that's part of the reason. Possibly, there's both people have been somewhat calm because they're still a bit hopeful about it. And of course, the usual problem with the lag that you hear the huge case numbers, but the hospital figures look okay, a little bit dodgy, and you're not calculating. Oh well, what does that mean about the 100,000 this week? If I'm seeing this from 30,000 cases in the previous, it's probably 40,000 by now in the previous period. So there's that going on. So it's quite complicated. It's also people just being exhausted, wanting to get it over with, and thinking that this will get it over, and it might in the short term.
Pull those through.
But we don't. Yeah, I mean, we don't really know what's going to be happening 6 months or 12 months down the line.
What's kind of alarming is we have no idea what's going to happen next week with 106,000 cases when they wash out in terms of the 10-day lag, and that 106,000 might really be 240,000. And
but don't forget if you're in terms of that calculation, that it's the percent going to hospital where always of the actual cases measured.
Right.
So the fact that the way you've been twice as many infections, that's built in. Don't double count it.
Okay.
So
right. Right. Yeah. Okay. Still enough to be alarmed about. Okay. Well, that's fine. I think we're all up to speed and we know what to look out for. And there doesn't seem to be an alternate plan, so we just keep going.
Yep, that seems
keep
to be.
on trucking.
We're going to see what happens.
Yeah,
that appears to be the
plan. Place your bets.
Yeah.